Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to one more episode of Cleantech Geek. It's an honor today to have with me Mr. Jorg Heinemann from EnerVenue. Jorg, welcome to Cleantech Geek. And today what we're going to discuss is something which is very current with the implementation and introduction of more renewable energy, especially in all the different grids around the world in the global electricity generation system. We will need more batteries. We will need more storage. So this is a very sort of current topic. It's discussed with all the regulatory authorities around the world, and it's something that troubles all us developers when we develop projects either on the generation or the storage side. So, Jorg, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. Looking forward for a very insightful discussion. And just to start with, can you tell us briefly a bit about you and also how it all began and what is your vision?
Terrific. Good to be with you, Epatios. Yeah, I'm Jorg Heinemann. I'm the CEO of EnerVenue. I've been in renewable energy in a variety of roles now for the last 14 years. That includes about 4 years in batteries and 8 years before that as part of the senior executive team at SunPower doing large-scale solar development, installation, and operations of solar power plants around the world. And in what feels like a lifetime before that, I was a senior partner with Accenture for many, many years in the high-tech business. And about a year and a half ago, after nearly 3 years in the battery world, I was about to leave batteries and go back into a different part of the energy value chain because I had concluded I thought that the battery game had largely been won by lithium-ion batteries. And I received a call through a search firm looking for a CEO who wanted to take on a new battery startup to assist a founder named Professor Yi Shui at Stanford. And I thought, oh man, here we go again, another battery startup. What's this going to be like? Well, it turns out that Professor Shui had thought about or taken a fresh look at the battery sector and thought about, well, what would be a really good way of making a super durable, super flexible, incredibly long-lasting battery? And what he concluded was nickel hydrogen was the way to do it. And he got really excited. Then he started looking around and realized that actually that had been done already actually over 30 years ago. And then these types of batteries, which operate completely differently from other batteries, had actually been in operation for over 3 decades. However, they were incredibly expensive. So he set his team about how do we build that same kind of battery, but with far lower cost materials. And that result is what we're doing now. And we have a unique battery. It functions in a very different way from other technologies like lithium ion. And it has unique advantages and characteristics, as well as a very attractive cost profile, both upfront cost and overall levelized cost of energy. So it's quite exciting.
It sounds that you've put a bit of innovation into action there. But before we go into the innovative bit, we've seen quite a huge evolution on the battery technology over the past 10 years. So the battery technology has evolved. So in your opinion, what are the main drivers behind that sort of evolution, and how things are going to look perhaps in 10 years from now?
Yeah, I think what's happened here is about 10 or 12 years ago, when renewable energy began to gain popularity and folks like me got into the business, I think the expectation was that solar and batteries would grow, evolve, and take hold at about the same rate. I think certainly the clean tech investment community believed that. And what we saw is that the adoption of solar, the cost reduction of solar, the capability advantages advanced very, very rapidly and have now reached the point where solar is the no-brainer source of power generation around the world, the most economical way you can generate power, period, and it's only getting cheaper. However, it's taken batteries a much longer time to get to that point. The primary challenge historically has been cost. We've always been able to use batteries for, as long, at a super, super high price. I think 6 years ago, we were looking at the typical price around $1,000 per kilowatt hour of storage. Now it's down to roughly 1/5 that, around 200 and falling fast. But it took a long time to get there. And the ability to scale up and the ability for these batteries of different forms and factors and technologies to actually work and function has been harder. So it's just a more difficult thing to do, the evidence would show, for battery companies to figure out chemistries and get them to work and that sort of thing. I think we're going to see rapid advancement now, accelerating quickly on the battery front for all types of batteries, for chemical batteries, and that includes the type of battery that we at EnerVenue are building, as well as continued cost reduction and maturity for lithium ion batteries, as well as for things like mechanical storage and things like thermal storage and so forth for certain use cases. So it's kind of it's an all of the above, and it's badly needed because the logical progression is to take inexpensive, frankly close to free renewable power, whether that's solar or wind, and store that in a battery for times when the sun is not shining, the wind is not blowing, and the net result is a 100% clean energy electric power capability that can serve us at all scales across the energy value chain going forward.
But I would add to that what we need to do as an industry is to offer that the right sort of price, which is a point that we're going to touch a bit later on in our discussion. So regarding that evolution that you were just mentioning, I mean, a natural sort of suspect would be the EVs, would be the electric vehicles that are driving this sort of evolution. Higher capacity in the in a smaller space, more condensed, but also the need for storing intermittent power production from renewable energy sources in order to replace perhaps that base load that more traditional, fossil-driven generation forms might offer. Do you see anything else on that space, or these are the two sort of main areas that they drive forward the development and the evolution in the battery space?
Yeah, I think I would perhaps take a step back and say we have been enjoying a electric power industry that has been essentially unchanged around the world for the last 100, perhaps even 150 years. And that value chain, that electric power industry has been based on central station generation, typically through fossil fuel-based power plants, pushed one way over transmission lines and then distributed to a point of variable load. And it's worked quite remarkably and inexpensively in most parts of the world. If you think about what we pay for electric power that comes from our power outlet, and it arrives there reliably at very low cost, despite the variability on the load side, and we're used to it, and it works. And that's a value chain that has essentially no inventory in it, meaning it's always stays perfectly imbalanced, and at least in the developed world, the lights stay on, and it's there when we need it.
Most of the time,
yeah. But most of the time, perhaps a little less so. And that old value chain is now being massively disrupted. It's being disrupted because the least expensive form of power generation by far is intermittent. It's solar and it's wind. And those two things are already below 2 cents per kilowatt hour in many parts of the world, and they're falling faster. And as those power generating assets fully amortize, that incremental cost will essentially be zero. So you've got the cheapest form of power is intermittent. Then in parallel with that, we've been deregulating the electric power industry around the world. So we've been allowing consumers and companies and whoever to buy power from whatever source they want and have it be pushed across the transmission grid, which causes congestion, much like on a freeway system. So we have deregulation causing congestion, and then we have an aging power infrastructure that is subject to failures. In California, it's been the source of wildfires and things as power infrastructure elements are failing. And then on the distributed end, on the consumer end, we have the proliferation of both local generation and distributed solar, in some cases distributed wind, as well as the electrification of everything, as we see the adoption of electric vehicles, and we see the adoption of electrification of homes, of cooking, of kind of everything we do. Layer on top of that the challenge we have with climate change, and it's almost a perfect storm of we have an electric power value chain that is fundamentally going to be rethought, reshaped, and rebuilt in the coming years. Now, I can't tell you whether it's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, certainly 50 years from now. The electric power grid as we know it and the electric power industry will be fundamentally different. And so every part of that, begin with electrify everything, and then rethink how things work. Well, instead of a one-way value chain, we're going to have variable generation. We're going to have flexible transmission and distribution, buffered with lots and lots of energy storage mechanisms. And then at the consumer end, we'll have distributed generation, local storage, and a whole lot of the world will be able to effectively defect from the grid simply based on economic reasons. Meaning I can generate solar on my house, put it in a battery, self-consume that, and cover perhaps all of my electric power needs myself without even needing the grid. And that'll be true in many parts of the world and for many customers, and increasingly so. So we have a fundamental transformation. I'd sum it up and say I think it's the single biggest economic transformation that we will see in our lifetimes, even bigger than the internet, perhaps.
I would agree definitely on on that. I think I've been discussing a lot with my students in the university, saying that if you see at our at how the world runs at the moment, the single point that there's been the less sort of innovation until now is the power grid. It's the transmission. It's how do we generate energy, and you look at these sort of big towers, the transmission towers, the grid towers. It's zero evolution, zero innovation until a few years ago. The whole thing remained pretty much the same since it started. So it's definitely, I would definitely agree there with you that I think it's quite exciting to see all of that and combine that with a smart grid, with a micro generation on consumer level, the two-way sort of interactive way that the consumers or prosumers, as they call now, will start interacting with the grid and all the extra services that we can offer through that. So going back to the technology, we've seen that lithium ion has been the dominant one, and there is a reason, and I would like to hear your opinion on that. But given your technology, and I would like also to know, how do you classify your batteries? Is there a classification that you use within your technology? And what sort of changes are we going to see? What is up and coming? And does one sort of solution fit all, or do we have to go and specialize and look at the application? What do we need to do, and then apply the right sort of technology to it?
Great. Well, so let's take a closer look at the technology, and I'll begin with lithium ion. Lithium ion turns out to be a very effective energy storage technology for a lot of different use cases. It's very energy dense and getting denser, meaning you can store a lot of energy in a small, lightweight footprint. That makes it ideal for mobile applications. It can be used quite flexibly, meaning it can be charged quickly or slowly and then discharged fast or slow. And then the cost is coming down quite rapidly because of the scale-up factor, meaning the amount of battery factory capacity being brought online to mostly to support electric vehicle batteries. So it's quite good. However, it has some fundamental challenges. It's taken a very long time to extend the life cycle or the cycle life of lithium-ion batteries. I think we're all familiar with our electronic devices, laptops, cell phones, and so forth, and the batteries tend to wear out. They degrade over time to the point where typically, depending on what you're doing with them, my iPhone is a couple years old now. It's 2 years old roughly, and the battery life is nowhere near what it was when I bought it, and I'm about to go get the battery replaced, perhaps the cell phone replaced. That same mechanism, basically that degradation, that cycle life, is a challenge. The other challenge that we see is temperature and kind of durability of these things. The chemistry involved in batteries, especially lithium-ion, it tends to have a happy zone that's roughly at room temperature. And if the battery gets too hot or too cold, then bad things happen. You can, if things get too hot, you can reach what's called the thermal runaway. Basically, the thing can catch on fire. If it gets too cold, it can be very difficult to sustain a charge or keep a charge. So there's a lot of sophisticated mechanisms required and a lot of systems that allow those batteries to stay within their happy zone, and you have to control it very carefully. So it's quite temperamental, and it's not nearly as durable as we would like batteries to be. Now, our technology, EnerVenue's technology, is fundamentally different from chemical batteries, which includes things like lithium-ion. And we store energy by as we charge, we build up hydrogen in a pressure vessel. And that, when we do that through a catalytic reaction, it's essentially the same as a fuel cell, like you might find in a fuel cell vehicle, but at a far lower pressure. So as we're charging, we build up hydrogen. That's how we store energy. And then as we discharge the battery, that hydrogen gets reabsorbed into water, in simple terms. And the nature of that hydrogen evolution, hydrogen oxidation reaction chain is really, really robust. So it allows for, it allows for extreme temperatures. This works at 60 degrees Celsius. It works at minus 40 degrees Celsius without heating systems, without air conditioning systems, without, it can't catch on fire. There's no safety issues, so you don't have to have a fire suppression system. So it's extremely robust in that sense. It also withstands abuse, meaning the battery can be overcharged or over discharged. And if you've ever let your car battery drain all the way to zero, maybe you've done that once or twice, or say 2 or 3 times at least, you recognize that the battery needs to be replaced pretty quickly after going all the way to zero. Well, our battery withstands that no problem. So you can drain it all the way and then the battery lives on fine. You can also overcharge it, which would cause a fire or a failure in the battery in most batteries, but our battery, EnerVenue's battery, lives happily through that. And the net is we have a battery that has a cycle life of at least 30,000 cycles. That would be 3 full cycles a day for 30 years. It's basically an infinite life battery, and it requires no maintenance. It doesn't need to be touched during that time, so it's an install and forget battery. These batteries were designed nearly 30 years ago for use in outer space, specifically satellites and things like the International Space Station and Hubble Space Telescope. So the use case was a battery that would last forever, withstand the rigors of outer space, and require no maintenance. And then our principal innovation is finding a way to do that with very low-cost materials that are earth abundant, that allows us to compete at an upfront cost, a capital cost, similar to lithium ion, and deliver the customer, though, a battery that has this extreme flexibility and durability, but with a zero maintenance cost associated with it. And that's a significant advantage because of that set of capabilities. And it's really, really useful, particularly for stationary use cases. Our batteries are somewhat heavier and larger, and you wouldn't want to use it in anything mobile. Certainly not a cell phone or a vehicle or that kind of thing. But it's great for pairing it with renewable power, or simply having it as stationary battery buffers, if you will, along the electric power value chain.
So what you're saying is that actually we need to see the application, and for each application there is a specific technology that fits the outfit, if you would like, fits the bill. So one technology or one system does not fit all. You've touched also on the limitations of battery technology. You talked about the life cycle, the charge and discharge cycles, and so on and so forth. So what is the improvement that we can expect? Are we going to see improvements that will be, let's say, a factor of 5 or a factor of 50? I mean, I remember looking at a documentary about the Tesla batteries that they were using in the initial Tesla S, and the batteries that they're using now in Tesla 3, and they were saying that within a period of 5, 6, 10 years, they've managed to pretty much increase the capacity by about 50% on that specific technology. So what is your take in all of this?
Yeah, so I think it depends on the use case. So what we're seeing in the electrical vehicle industry is the technology evolving from a very limited number of cycles. 20 years ago, lithium-ion batteries could last maybe 200 cycles. They're now at, depending on the use case, they can be stretched into the thousands. For electric vehicles, the target has been grow the number of cycles to approximately 500. I think 500 full charge discharge cycles, but expand the capacity at weight to allow a 500-mile or more range for the vehicle. Today, the typical newer generation electric vehicles are, say, in the 250-mile range. So the industry is seeking to double that and do it in a way that allows a very fast charge. Think 10 or 15 minutes to charge the equivalent of a tank of gas. So think use case: light, long range, and fast charging. That's what the EV batteries are optimizing for, and that's where lithium-ion technology is particularly well suited. Now, on the stationary use cases, which is more where we play, it's a little bit of a different game. We and our competitors are working on how do you stretch the cycle life? How do you get, not to say a small number of thousands, 1, 2, 3, or 4,000 cycles, but how do you grow that to 10,000 cycles, to 15,000 cycles, to 30,000 cycles? Candidly, we're already there. And then how do you do that at very low cost? So it fundamentally becomes a game of what's the cost per kilowatt hour that I would pay upfront to install my system, and then how much additional maintenance cost is there to maintain that battery storage solution over time. And with most batteries, other technologies, they tend to degrade. The battery wears out, and those battery packs or parts of those battery packs need to be augmented or replaced, or the owner of the system needs to think, oh, I'm going to oversize the battery and plan for this degradation over time, as well as be really careful about how I use the battery to stretch its usable lifetime. So that's kind of another evolution. What we're doing is we're coming at it from a different way. We're saying our battery, it just inherently lasts forever, 30,000 cycles. In fact, the earlier versions of these batteries ran for upwards of 100,000 cycles. So it's basically a forever battery. And it's incredibly flexible. So we can allow the customer not to have to kind of to baby the battery and be really careful with it. We can allow them to do a fast charge or a slow charge or a fast discharge followed by a slow discharge, or whatever mix and match they want, and they don't have to think about how am I going to use this thing. So it's a different way of coming at the problem, and that's inherent in our technology, where because we're basically operating like a half of a fuel cell that's reversible. We've got this capability of a super flexible, super durable battery that we think is going to be really useful, not just for the use cases that we know about today. I think the biggest challenge is going to be the use cases of the future as we get to this new electric power value chain that we know it's going to be different. We know this variability that's been introduced at point of generation, at point of transmission, at point of distribution. We know there's going to be the need for a whole lot of batteries. And we think we know what that looks like. We have a pretty good idea for the next couple of years. I think, candidly, the industry is not sure what exactly we're going to need, say 5 years from now, 10 years from now, et cetera. What do I want my battery to do? Well, what I'm absolutely certain of is we're going to need a lot of batteries that can operate at very low cost for a super long life and can be used very flexibly, meaning dispatched fast or slow based on whatever is called for at that point in time. So think about it like our cell phones. We're used to, and even electric vehicles for that matter, we're used to being able to charge these devices quite quickly. Plug it into the wall, I get within as little as 15 minutes, as long as maybe an hour or two, I get close to a full charge. And then I can dispatch that battery fast or slow, depending on how I'm using my cell phone. Well, the same thing is going to be true at larger scale. And that's something that is quite difficult in the industry. We do, EnerVenue does that really well. Candidly, the other types of technology tend to struggle with that. They tend to want either a really fast charge followed by a fast discharge, or very typically, more often than not, very slow charge, followed by a slow and steady discharge. So that's an area of innovation. And then, of course, the other innovation to look for is cost, because there's a lot of discussion in the industry about so-called short duration batteries and medium duration batteries and long duration or ultra long duration, even getting into seasonal, et cetera. And the fundamental difference between all of those is really cost. What's the price point? What's the cost per kilowatt hour? The cost per cycle of charge discharge cycle. That's fundamentally what makes it economically feasible to have something be usable as a long duration storage device, or simply only as a short one.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You've touched on cost, and I think this is quite important, Jorg. Looking at how the situation currently is on the developed world, and let's take the Western developed world more as an example rather than anything else. And if I calculate the current sort of cost of utilization of the grid and the generation as it stands now, and then I compare it with a sort of system that is driven by solar plus storage, then we look at, from a consumer's point of view, at 2 to 3 times the cost if you compare the two. So this is a current issue that we need to face as an industry. So is there a way to address that? Are we going to address that through more deployment? And as we deploy more, we expect costs to be driven down. So it's economies of scale. Are we addressing that through innovation? Is it a combination of many different factors? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, I actually the numbers I'm seeing are, might actually argue against your hypothesis or view it in a slightly different way. And I'll begin with the developing world. So think, parts of Africa, for example, that today rely on diesel fuel generation, basically generators powered by diesel fuel. The levelized cost of that, meaning that the cost per kilowatt hour of power, tends to be in the $20 to $30 per kilowatt hour range, which is extraordinarily expensive. It's even higher if that particular customer is in a very remote location or perhaps a dangerous location where the cost of transporting the diesel fuel increases. It can be 50 cents or a dollar per kilowatt hour of generation. Contrast that with, at today's prices, solar plus a battery plus perhaps a diesel generator as backup in case there's an extended cloudy period. And in most places, comfortably, a customer can do solar plus storage for half of the cost, half the levelized cost, meaning being 10 to 15 cents per kilowatt hour, total cost of power generated on a levelized basis. So, in other words, it's more economical to go renewable in these cases. The same thing we're finding is increasingly true in the Western world. I live here in California. I've got a brother who's doing a lot of solar installations for rental properties that he owns, and he's able to essentially build those at a cost paired with batteries that would allow those individual homes to defect from the grid. Now, he's doing that at wholesale prices at the moment, but we're very close to that with where battery storage prices are headed, where my whole neighborhood, individually or as a collective, could easily be able to defect from the grid and generate and self-consume our own renewable power at a price that's far less than we would be paying the local electric utility. And that phenomenon is going to take hold around the world. And of course, it depends somewhat on how much solar resource is available, but the basic principles are, and the economic gravity, if you will, of falling prices for renewable generation, falling prices for storage, will allow us to do those sorts of things virtually everywhere over time. I say virtually because there are locations where it's darker, you don't have as much solar resource, you need to rely on, say, wind power, et cetera. But with the right capacity of batteries at the right price point, and all indications are we're heading there and quite rapidly, we will be able to do it. I think to a far greater degree than a lot of the analysts who are studying this today tend to believe.
Yeah, I think we've seen we've beaten every expectation on the solar side, at least looking from 2000 until now, all the projections of how solar and wind would be developed from the International Energy Association or the authorities around the world. I think the predictions were beaten in every single case. So hopefully we will see the same sort of rapid deployment of batteries, and I think we cannot have the one without the other. So that's why now you have the so-called initial developers that were doing solar and wind, that they're now also jumping into the storage sort of battery, let's say, train to move forward. So it's definitely coming there. Now, we do have a significant investment on the storage side and on the battery side. I think there is millions and millions being pumped into that. You've got the main sort of players, BYD, LG, and all the others, Tesla perhaps, that they're driving that. But there is also many startups like yours that are trying to capitalize on a novel technology or an idea or something, or repurpose something or was used differently into a different way and turn it into a storage sort of facility. We've seen situations with gravitational storage and pumped hydro and all sorts of different things that people came with. But also this sort of startups, and I think it was Bill Gates in his last book that famously said that he's lost a lot of money in battery startups. It's so where are we going, and why is your company EnerVenue a different? Why are you going to be, you think, a success instead of just another statistic?
Yeah, I mean, I think the industry has learned an awful lot over the last decade. As I mentioned earlier, I think 10 years ago, the cleantech investment community believed batteries would be where many, many fortunes are made and would evolve roughly at the same rate as solar. And of course, that hasn't happened. I think we've lagged behind by about 10 years. But I believe the industry has learned a lot. And one of the things the industry has learned is that scale and cost trumps everything else. I think that's why we're seeing electric vehicles or lithium-ion batteries bolstered by the volume of EVs coming online and the capacity required. Those costs have come down the fastest. The second thing that I think we've learned is the importance of having a low maintenance cost. And unfortunately, many of the alternative battery plays spent a number of years working with flow battery companies, for example, struggle from a really complicated device, plumbing, moving parts, filters, membranes that need to be replaced, those sorts of things that create a maintenance-intensive energy storage solution, really complicated with a heavy maintenance cost. And that has an extraordinary impact on the overall cost of the energy solution. And it's much bigger, I think, than most folks realize. Typically, for a power plant, this is true for a solar plant, it's true for a gas thermal plant, it's true for a solar plus storage or wind plus storage, et cetera. The cost breakdown in terms of cost per kilowatt hour tends to be roughly in thirds. Typically, 1/3 is comprised by the upfront capital cost, the cost to build the plant, acquire the solar panels, the batteries, the land, construct it, develop it, all that stuff. Another third is the financing, the cost of debt, cost of equity, et cetera. And then a full remaining third is typically the operations and maintenance cost over the life of that plant. So having a storage device, or frankly any kind of technology that has even a small maintenance component, even a couple to 4% a year, which is the typical range, adds up massively to this 1/3 of the cost. And what we're finding is the lower maintenance technology solutions win as a result of that. And one thing EnerVenue brings is essentially a zero maintenance cost. We've got an install and forget, last forever battery. That's a huge economic advantage over technologies that have kind of a complicated maintenance mechanism built in, just based on the complexity of their devices. Then perhaps the most important thing is the nature of flexibility of these devices. One of the reasons lithium-ion has been so dominant is because it allows us to charge the battery pretty quickly and then dispatch it fast or slow based on the use case. That's something EnerVenue does, frankly, even more flexibly than lithium-ion. So we've got the ability to charge fast or slow, dispatch fast or slow, depending on today's known use case, depending on anticipated tomorrow use case, and depending on where, whatever the surprises that may come at us in the future. And a lot of the alternative storage technologies struggle with that. They're good typically at a real slow charge followed by a real fast discharge. A real slow charge followed by a slow discharge, which makes it hard to adapt those to the kind of the flexible, changing use cases and evolve into the future and so forth. So I think that's been one of the significant barriers that we've faced. Now, having said all that, I think there's a lot of room for different alternatives. Pumped hydro has been around for many decades, and it's widely considered the gold standard in terms of clean, renewable power that is quite inexpensive. However, you can't put pumped hydro everywhere. You need difference in elevation, and it's a pretty complicated thing, et cetera. It's not something that can be easily installed or permitted in many parts of the world, in many localities. So there's a place for gravity. There's a place for thermal storage, perhaps in certain situations. There's definitely a lot of room for very effective batteries, particularly those that are flexible, durable, and long-lasting. And then there's another layer on this, which is sustainability and concern for the environment of the actual battery technologies themselves. And when you look under the covers of how are these energy storage solutions made, what are the main elemental ingredients, the chemicals, the processes required, how does a battery get recycled at the end of its lifetime effectively, and so forth. We're seeing increasing concern and awareness around that around the world, particularly with lithium-ion batteries, which tend to be very difficult to manufacture, very difficult to recycle, and quite dangerous throughout their life cycle. EnerVenue, for example, has a super simple battery. The manufacturing process is really simple, perhaps 1/5 as cost intensive to build the battery per unit of volume, and then it's really easy to take apart and recycle. So it's what the sustainability people call a cradle to cradle product. So we take earth abundant materials, we make a battery that lasts for a very long time. At the end of that life cycle, it can be easily taken apart safely, quickly, and at low cost, and repurposed for either use in another battery or some other use.
Jorg, just a quick intervention there. I mean, I hear what you say. One of the big sort of issues that we're facing as developers / investors is the bankability factor. So how does a small new startup, despite the significant success you had on raising new capital, and someone has to recognize that, but how does a small startup goes over the hurdle of bankability? How are you going to achieve that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think the energy community is inherently risk averse, meaning they're looking for demonstration that a new technology, even though we're a 30-year-old technology that we're simply cost reducing, it's still perceived as new by especially the project lenders who are providing financing for projects. Until we've demonstrated hundreds of megawatts in the field, we get that. So we're overcoming that in a few ways. First of all, the investors that we have behind this are very large-scale A-list institutions who understand our technology. They've seen it. They understand the team. They know what it can do. They know that it fundamentally works. So everything we're doing it's not a science project. It's taking a known technology that functions and simply optimizing the engineering and scaling it up. So they're aware of that, and then they're providing backing. So our initial customer deployments will largely be based on lease financing, meaning we're leasing the batteries to customers. We have the capital to do that, and therefore the customer does not have to take that so-called bankability risk. They can simply basically buy the energy usage of the battery. We expect what will happen.
They will have a risk of supply, though. Imagine that you have a corporate PPA and that you need to supply, and that batteries, so the storage technologies is part of your, of your overall solution. You might not have the bankability on the capex side, or the risk on the capex side, but you will have the risk on the supply side, won't you, if something goes wrong?
Oh yeah, it's a question of who carries the risk. And the bankability question is fundamentally around who, it really boils down to, will the bank, the lender who is providing capital for a customer's energy project, will they provide that at a low interest rate, at attractive financing, essentially? And because the energy and value chain is so competitive, especially at the grid scale level, there's basically low profit, and it requires low risk. So a banker will not lend money to a project unless they're comfortable with every piece of the technology, and that's considered unless the technology is so-called bankable. And to establish bankability requires a track record. We saw the same thing happen in solar. We built, my team built what at the time was one of the world's largest solar power plants. This was back in 2011. It was a 250 megawatt AC, 340 megawatt peak solar power plant. And we had to build it essentially with a parental guarantee from our parent company in order to get that done, because we would not otherwise be able to attract the right kind of financing. Well, 2 years later, we built a plant that was more than twice the size, at half the cost, with absolutely zero bank guarantee, or zero parental guarantee, and we were essentially considered what had been not bankable, supposedly, 2 years earlier was now 100% bankable and considered widely adopted around the world. And basically the difference was, maybe you could argue there was a little bit more track record, perhaps 1 year's worth of field data, but the investment community's confidence in solar overall had suddenly overcome that hurdle and reached sufficient confidence. We saw the same thing happen in late 2017 or early 2018 for large-scale battery deployments for lithium-ion batteries, solar plus storage applications specifically. Up until then, the industry was basically looking at itself, thinking that the batteries of any kind, including lithium-ion, were considered new and untested and unproven at grid-scale use, and therefore they quote-unquote were not bankable. Then suddenly in Q1 of 2018, there was a tender process, a public RFP process. The results announced that Xcel Energy had done in Colorado, and they showed 400 bids from 250 developers pricing solar plus storage projects, and the average levelized cost of those projects was somewhere in the 3.6 cents per kilowatt hour, $36 per megawatt hour range. And suddenly overnight, the renewable energy community, including the bankers, realized in order to achieve that cost point, there's no room for any kind of margin or risk. So it means rock bottom material cost, rock bottom maintenance cost, rock bottom financing cost. Okay, if we're going to see that for 400 bids, we know there are bankers who are willing to get behind this technology. Therefore, lithium-ion batteries must be bankable. So almost overnight, certainly quarter to quarter, that bankability switch flipped to on, and ever since, that particular storage technology has been considered fully bankable. So we expect the same thing to happen to other demonstrated capable technologies, especially ones like ours that have the advantage of a 30-year track record of these types of batteries, having worked in applications on the harshest climates conceivable, which is outer space.
Jorg, very quickly, when are you going to have your full first commercial application with your technology?
We'll be deploying those later this year.
Later this year, by end of the year. Okay.
That's right.
Now, as a last sort of closing thoughts, I mean, we need to be driving more an increased sort of mix of renewable energy into the global electricity system. I think latest figures in 2020 were about 11% penetration of renewables in total, but also a massive increase in coal-fired new power stations, especially in countries like China. Now, where should our priorities be at this stage? Where do you think, as an industry, we should focus more? We should focus our energy on innovation, our investment, and how can we accelerate more deployment of renewables and storage?
Yeah, I think it's a very challenging question for all of us, and it's interesting because we've reached a point where renewable power has economic gravity on our side, meaning new wind generation, new solar generation, coupled with batteries, is the lowest cost form of generation going forward. So if you look at what this is why all the money is pouring in. Let's set sustainability aside, let's set climate change aside and say, if I'm a power plant developer, the same people developing gas thermal plants a couple decades ago, or even coal plants before that, are now investing their resources in renewables. And they're doing it because it's the most economically viable. And certainly that's only going to become better going forward because the costs continue to come down. And what's economically viable today becomes more and more attractive in the future. So economic gravity is on our side. That's true at all portions of the value chain, from grid scale through commercial and industrial, all the way down to distributed. Our challenge is we've got man-made climate change, the global warming effect looming over our heads, and we need speed. We need to get there faster than just normal economic forces would otherwise achieve. So that means we need essentially everything that can help us make that transition faster. It means it begins with policy decisions around the world that help incentivize bringing up capacity for renewables, that help incentivize renewable energy projects, that help levelize the playing field, meaning make it as expensive or preferably more expensive to continue to consume fossil fuel-based energy in all forms. And kind of in everything that we can imagine. Now there's a big debate about what's most effective. Do you focus on the grid scale? Do you focus on transmission? Do you focus on the distributed end? My view is it's all of the above, and it varies by location or whatever is most suited to a particular place. But we really need everything, and we should have very low tolerance for continuing to perpetuate high carbon generating forms of power and energy going forward.
And on that thought, Jorg, thank you very much for a very insightful discussion, and I look forward for our next one. Thank you very much.
Terrific, Ipatio. Great to be with you. Thank you.